Thank you for joining me for this special Meet the Creator Q&A with an online audience. My name is Elizabeth Kleinberg and I am the Film Program Coordinator at Riverside Theatres. Our special guest tonight is Exhibition on Screen's Executive Producer and Director, Phil Grabsky. The Exhibition on Screen film series has been part of the Riverside Theatres cinema program for many years. Phil Grabsky has been making documentaries for over 30 years and is a multi-award winner. Welcome, Phil, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Very welcome. Good evening. Very happy to be here.
To begin, where and when did your passion for visual arts start? And what are your earliest memories?
I can remember as a small boy actually being taken to a couple of things. When I was very small, I used to walk with my mother to the nearby town, and we would go past a park. And in that park was a tiny little museum in which they had those kind of display cases full of bits of dinosaur bone and Roman pottery, and I loved it. And from that moment on, I must have been about 5 or 6, I had this passion for history, but a little bit for art, so that came a bit later. I also remember my parents, we lived in the north of England, but we went down to London and we went to the Tutankhamun exhibition. And I was certainly extraordinarily impressed by that.
What is the genesis of Exhibition on Screen and what inspired you to create the series?
Actually, when I started making films in the middle of the 1980s, my focus was on history and on social documentaries. But in 1997, I was rung up by a commissioning editor who said, would I like to make a series of films about the Impressionists? And I thought he meant comedians, to be honest. He said, no, I mean artists. Nobody knows, but we have this public service requirement to do 26 hours only, 26 hours a year, half an hour a week. We've been covering it by doing a book show on a Sunday afternoon, but the host is going away for 8 weeks. Would you make 8 half-hour programs about the Impressionists? And we said, yes, of course. And they were very popular. And they were so popular, they then put them out at peak time, 7 p.m. weekdays, where they also were very popular. And from then on, for about 20 years, we became the biggest producer of art films, independent art films in the world, actually. But it was always a struggle with television. And, for example, in Australia, we used to always sell our programs to SBS Arts Channel, and that just disappeared. And that was true elsewhere in the world. Television has always undervalued the arts, unfortunately. But then came along the digital possibilities of cinema. I mean, it's remarkable what we're doing now. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, to distribute a film, you had to distribute with film in tins and cans, and it was very expensive, and cinemas weren't sure about showing art films at all. All that has changed. And the very first digital release in Australia was a film that I made about Mozart, and we released it on DVD, and it ran for 6 months. I remember, I'll never forget it. Now, of course, from 2007, 2008, you had the Met Opera, who had this idea of, we'll record an opera in New York on a Saturday afternoon at 2 p.m. and then via satellites, there's nowhere on the planet that can't watch it live. In Australia and New Zealand, it was recorded and shown maybe a day or two later. But at 7 p.m. in London or 8 p.m. in Paris, people were watching live opera. And then came along theatre. And then we started Exhibition on Screen in 2011 with a film called Leonardo Live. The only way I could persuade the cinemas in the UK to take it was if it was live from the opening night of this massive Leonardo exhibition. But live is not the way to make these films, so I only did that the once. And here we are, a decade later, we've just finished our 25th Exhibition on Screen, and my love of art remains undiminished. I'm making a film right now about Raphael, and I absolutely love it.
How has Exhibition on Screen developed or changed over the years?
The first thing I had to achieve was to persuade cinemas that it didn't have to be live to get an audience. Initially, they thought that this new area of event cinema was being successful, but it was being successful on the back of, in particular, the Met Opera and the Royal Opera House and the National Theatre in London. And people thought, well, the reason it's successful is because it's a live event. And when you go to the cinema, you feel you are actually sitting in London, in New York, or Sydney, if it's opera. That was partly true, but the experience of going to the theatre or the opera is very different to the experience that you want to have when you go to a gallery. And I said that actually what our films have to be, it is the exhibition when we film an exhibition, which is not always, not every film. Michelangelo is not based on an exhibition. When you film an exhibition, that has to be a springboard to making a kind of fresh, revealing new biography of the artist. And actually what people want, and in a funny kind of way, COVID, for all the damage it's doing, if you can get into galleries, the experience will be better because the audience, the visitors will be 20% of what they used to be. Maybe now if you go to the Louvre and you get in, you will actually be able to see the Mona Lisa, for example. Maybe when you queue in the Vatican to see the Sistine Chapel, you won't queue for 2 hours with 10,000 people around you. Anyway, when people go to galleries, actually what people want is to see a painting with as few people around them as possible, and maybe just have, you know, in your ideal world, you might have the curator next to you or the director of the gallery next to you, explaining what it is you're looking at. My belief is that we are all equally intelligent, curious human beings. And the reason that most of us don't know very much about subjects is that we just haven't had the opportunity to learn, or it hasn't been on television, or our parents didn't take us to a gallery, or whatever it might be. So we've all heard of these names, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, Frida Kahlo, but often we don't really know very much about them. You know, we've just finished a film on Frida Kahlo. She is the most popular female artist in history. But if you ask someone, can you name a painting? I mean, 99% of people will be completely blank. They won't be able to name a painting. And you'll say, well, what do you know about her? Why did she emerge out of Mexico City? I mean, all the questions that we ask as filmmakers, or I ask as a filmmaker, why Mexico City? Why her? What? Anyway, people don't know the answers, but they want to know the answers. So the first thing we had to do was to get rid of the live. That was fine. The first film went into 42 cinemas in the United Kingdom. It sold out in 41 of them. And from then on, cinemas were quite happy for us to do what we wanted and not do it live. Live is also expensive. The second thing was that first series that we did, the first 3 or 4, we had a presenter called Tim Marlowe, who had been our television presenter. He is fantastic. But I was slightly uncomfortable with that. That still felt a little bit like television, having a presenter on the screen. So we moved away from that. And I guess the major development is we've tried to make them, we're constantly trying to make them as cinematic as possible, while still allowing you to look at the artwork. We still have people explaining, you know, they're pedagogic to some extent, but it is cinema. People who come to your cinema, they may want to be educated, of course, but they primarily want to be entertained. They want to be transported to these wonderful locations, to the lives of these artists. And the other thing I'll say is that only about half of our films are actually based on exhibitions. So right now, the Raphael is based on the biggest Raphael exhibition ever, but we're also making a film about the sunflowers. And that, actually, no, sorry, that was based on an exhibition. The Michelangelo that we're about to talk about, that was just us wanting to make a film about Michelangelo. So again, there's a mix between films that are just biographies and films that are biographies but based on exhibitions.
How do you go about filming each cinema event? And how do you work with the galleries and capture the artworks for screen?
We've worked with so many major institutions now. I mean, initially when we were having to explain to people what it was we were doing, there would be 3 or 4 or 5 meetings at these galleries where you'd sit down, and gradually the group of people around the table would grow, and you'd have 15 people, and you'd be explaining, this is what exhibition on screen is. This is what the network is that we're building. We don't need to do that anymore. People know who we are and want us to make films about their exhibitions. We have more choice than we could possibly deal with. But again, the trick is, if you like, in a sense, although these are films about art and about visual objects, actually the key to them is the written text, the narrative. Cinema is about storytelling. It doesn't matter what the genre is, whether it's animation, fiction, documentary. If it's a great story, it's a great story. So we do spend a lot of time thinking, well, what is the story that we're about to tell? How are we going to tell the story of Michelangelo? How are we going to tell the story of Raphael? What is our approach? You know, we're not the first to make a film about Frida Kahlo, but there's plenty in our film about Frida Kahlo that I've not seen before, because our story was, let's look at her as an artist. Everyone else looks at her as you know, in relation to her relationship with Diego Rivera, and in a sense that's slightly, I don't think that's very fair on her, actually. She wanted to be seen as an artist. Let's look at her art. And then the biography all comes through. So storytelling is very important. Once you've got a sense of the storytelling, then you think about how we're going to present the art. And again, we're very lucky. The technology now is we're shooting in ultra high definition. Technically, it doesn't need to get any better, in my opinion. But again, we think, well, how are we going to present these artworks? How are we going to present these sculptures by Michelangelo, or these paintings by Michelangelo? How are we going to present the Sistine Chapel? So it takes a little bit of time. Once we've thought that through, then of course we have to seek additional permissions. And I mean, I have somebody in my office whose job is just endlessly seeking permissions for artworks or for access to galleries. That takes time. Currently working on, as I said, on the Raphael, you know, trying to gain access to film in the Vatican, even to do an interview with somebody from the Vatican, is extraordinarily complicated, but you just keep going. And I guess, like so many jobs, part of it is just sheer hard work, endless enthusiasm. But what is also very important is you know, the team that you have around you. So we have composers that write the scores. Music's hugely important. Our editors, well, I always work with the same editor. David, who directed Michelangelo, he actually edits the films himself. But often these films emerge from the editing process. So you know, these films can take 1 or 2 or even more years to make as well. Because the final thing I'll say here is that we are trying to make films which have what I call legacy value, that people will still be able to watch in 10 years' time or 20 years' time. Now, we won't be able to emulate Raphael or Leonardo, whose paintings are as powerful today as they were 500 years ago. But if our films can still have a value in 25 years, then that will be good, because we do live in this kind of disposable culture. One of the things it's changed a bit, but one of the things I grew to resent about television is you'd put all this effort into making a program, it would go out, and then it would disappear. At least now, a good film will have a long life.
I'm always struck by the emotion in the music in the films. I think it is an important part of the art and the storytelling. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
The score for any music is absolutely critical, any film. I mean, I could watch Dunkirk with my eyes shut just to listen to the score. We think very hard about what the music's going to be to each film. You know, the paintings were painted and are usually, of course, seen in silence up to a point. Obviously, they're not, because you've got people around you talking, breathing, eating, whatever, you know, in a gallery. Hopefully not eating. But so we think quite hard, and it kind of depends. Again, it's all part of the storytelling. When we did Painting the Modern Garden, Monet to Matisse, we went for quite a big score. When I did Cézanne, I went for something much more restrained and a very different kind of tonality. Leonardo the Works, last year, we went for period music, and I haven't yet been to a screening of Leonardo the Works where people aren't crying when the Salvator Mundi is on the screen. And part of that is the power of the music, power of the score. So we have two very good composers that we work with, and it's difficult actually writing the score. Where you start as a filmmaker is you go off and you look for similar pieces that you think are right. It might be pieces from previous films of yours or other people's, or you just go through CDs and Spotify and you find things that you think feel right. With Leonardo, we were lucky because, and it was deliberate, we waited towards the end of the 500th anniversary. And one of the advantages of doing that was that there was a group of period musicians who had made a CD of period music from that time. And we established a relationship with them and we were able to use some of it. With Michelangelo, we thought, you know, what's kind of the right music that keeps the film moving along. One of the difficulties with Michelangelo is that there's so much art. It's quite, you know, it's different. The story moves about quite a lot. So you run the risk of it all being a bit fragmented. So again, the score was important to try and hold it all together as a single film and to reflect his character.
Do you have a favorite film among the series or a favorite artist?
I used to be asked a very difficult question when I was touring with my In Search of Great Composers, my In Search of films, and people would say, because I made 4, Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin and Haydn, and people would say, who's your favorite? And I would say, look, I've got 2 kids. Imagine asking me who's my favorite. You can't answer a question like that. It's really hard to answer that question about favorite art, because the reason these are great artists is that they have achieved extraordinary things, I think, as human beings. And I see no evidence that this is replicated anywhere else in the galaxy, in the universe. So it's quite extraordinary. And part of the reason it's so powerful is that it communicates human emotion. As I said, I'm working on Raphael right now, and some of those Madonnas and Child, you know, the relationship between the mother and the child is so powerful, more than 500 years after it was originally painted. I would say that my favorite is always the one that I'm working on. And, you know, when I did the Monet film, I just thought he's the greatest artist. Cézanne, I just grew to absolutely adore Cézanne. The complexity of the color tonality in his paintings is quite extraordinary. I must say, when I saw the finished Michelangelo, and obviously I'm working with David and we write the scripts together, but when I sat and watched it in the cinema, I thought, actually, I think Michelangelo must be the greatest artist of all time. And it's partly the sculpture. I just think that the sculptures are just extraordinary, how you can create something like that out of marble. So it's a really difficult question. I don't really have an answer. I am looking forward to making a film in a couple of years' time about Caravaggio. In the past, I used to say Caravaggio was my favorite artist because I just think his paintings are so powerful and so interesting, and the storytelling is so vibrant. But it's an almost impossible question to answer.
In the film Canaletto and the Art of Venice, the 18th century artist Rosalba Carriera is briefly mentioned. This stood out for me as female artists during this time seems rare. Are there many other female artists throughout history, and has this changed in the present day?
Obviously, one of the questions that I get at Q&As is a perfectly legitimate question, which is, where are the female artists? And Frida Kahlo is the first film. It's the 25th exhibition on screen. It's the first one entirely dedicated to a female artist. And my response is, well, you know, to some extent, well, to a large extent, we are reflecting art history. It is quite plausible that when Mozart was growing up with his sister, that they were both equally talented, but it was Mozart that was given the opportunities and his sister wasn't. And I'm afraid that's a little bit like that in history. We've tried to, when we made the film about the Impressionists, I talked about Mary Cassatt and Bert Morisot as much as I could. We are trying to make a film about Artemisia Gentileschi. We looked very hard at trying to do a film about Georgia O'Keeffe, but the Tate were just too slow. There was an exhibition at the Tate, but they were just too slow to respond, and the moment passed. There were fewer, but there were female artists, and obviously as the centuries passed, that number has, increased. When I was doing television, it was probably, well, I can't say it was 50-50, but I mean, we were making films about female artists like Tracy Emin and others. For us on exhibition on screen, it's tricky doing, contemporary artists are tricky for 3 reasons. One, I have to say that most contemporary artists I've made films about can be quite difficult. I think they're so concerned about their image. So much of contemporary art is wrapped up in the image of the artist. And so they're quite hard to work with sometimes. 2, they can be very expensive. Our films are self-funded. So when we did a film, for example, about Hockney, or a film or an artist that's still in copyright like Picasso, it really costs us a lot of money. The third thing, which is perhaps the most important thing, is that will people actually come to the cinema? If within exhibition on screen there was a film about Tracy Emin, forget COVID for a second. If your cinema was potentially open to 100% capacity, I fear that you just wouldn't get a very big audience for it, and then we would go out of business. It is the case that the films that are most popular are still, and with some justification, but Cézanne and Van Gogh and Monet and Leonardo. We recently did a Lucian Freud film or the Hockney film. They just don't do as well. So contemporary female artists are also a little bit tricky for us. But as I say, Frida Kahlo, who is unquestionably the most famous female artist in history, that's a really strong film, because I don't think people know very much about her actually, and certainly not enough about her as an artist and why her. And the National Gallery in London it was scheduled to be doing it. They're saying they're still going to do it, an Artemisia Gentileschi film. She was painting more or less the same time as Caravaggio, very interesting artist. And we're hoping that we can film that. Again, it's these big exhibitions are going to be affected by COVID. They're very expensive to put on. And if your visitor numbers are cut from down to 20%, that will make it very, very hard to afford to put on an exhibition. It's hugely expensive, and so there's no guarantee that these big exhibitions will continue.
Yeah, that would be unfortunate. So Frida Kahlo forms part of the next exhibition on screen season to hit cinemas. Can you tell us a bit more about the other titles in that season that we can look forward to?
Yes. Now, Australia is obviously, because you have a slightly different schedule to the UK for various reasons. But so correct me if I miss any of them. But Frida Kahlo, which I've talked about. Raphael. Now, Raphael, which I'm working on right now, it's based on the biggest Raphael exhibition in history, which is, we filmed it in Rome. They shut 2 days after they opened. It was such a shame, but they have been able to reopen. Italy have suffered through COVID-19, but they've managed it better than the UK, for example, and they have been able to reopen. The way that they're getting I mean, they think they'll have, instead of 600,000 estimated visitors, they might get 200,000 now, so only a third. And that is being open from 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. And so that's, which is obviously quite different for them normally. It literally was one of those jaw-dropping moments for me when I walked into the exhibition for the first time, and it wasn't, we were filming it 4 days before it opened, so it wasn't completely ready. I was really staggered by the quality of the exhibition and the art within it. 200 artworks, 140 by Raphael, from drawings to cartoons for tapestries, and just fantastic. Again, one of those names that people know, and you'll certainly meet people who'll say, oh, I love this Madonna, or I love the stanza, the rooms in the Vatican. But actually, there's so much more to know about him. And in fact, the title of the film is Raphael Revealed, because I think, you know, we don't think people really understand who he was, why he did what he did. And again, what we do with Exhibition on Screen is we give you the opportunity to look at the art. Our audience, you know, we treat them as intelligent human beings who actually want to see the artworks. We don't need it all to be moving really quickly or have a presenter getting in the way. Let me look at, and in this day and age, even before COVID, people couldn't get to these exhibitions. It's even less likely now. So, I'm going back to Italy to do a bit more filming in 2 or 3 weeks, which is interesting under COVID, visors and gloves and masks. And anyway, then I think it has become our most popular film, which I wouldn't have predicted, but Cézanne is going to be our encore presentation. We always have an encore in each season. And it's interesting, sometimes the encores, they always do as well as the other films and sometimes better. I think last year our encore film was Rembrandt, and I think it was the most successful. Oh no, Leonardo was. Anyway, Cézanne, one of my favorite artists, one of my favorite films. Then, as you mentioned, Easter in Art was delayed, so that's going out next Easter. I directed that film, and I absolutely loved making that film. I have to say that when I went into galleries, you know, the religious art was not where I gravitated to. I would go to the Dutch art or Spanish art or the Impressionists. But I knew that the most painted story in history is the story is those last few days of Jesus's life, the Easter story, the Passion. And I thought, it's, you know, every major artist wanted to and did paint some part of that story. And I realized to myself, one, I wasn't really clear what the story was. And in fact, in talking to other people, I've not met anyone who really knows the story as told by the Gospels. And so what we did was first of all, we started with the Gospels and we pulled out the narrative. So it's really clear, this is what the narrative is supposed to be, or this is what the narrative is saying happened. And then we looked at great artists from across the centuries, how they represented the scenes. And indeed, there's one or two things that are frequently painted that actually aren't really in the Gospels. The Deposition, when Mary, I mean, one of the greatest artworks of all time is in the Vatican, the Pietà, where Mary is cradling her dead son, who's just come down off the cross. That's not really talked about in the Gospels. So what you have is a situation where this was a fantastic opportunity for artists to show what they were capable of. If you imagine artists who are always working for commission, you can't understand the history of art and artists without understanding it's for money. Raphael doesn't paint for fun. Leonardo doesn't paint for fun. They paint because they're commissioned to paint. And actually the trick is how they demonstrate their character and their personality within a commission. In just the same way as when I worked for television, if I was asked to make a series of films about the history of the Roman Empire, the trick was, how do I demonstrate that they are, you know, my films within the constraints of what the broadcaster wanted. Anyway, so you know, Leonardo and Raphael and Caravaggio and Rembrandt and so many more, they loved the opportunity to show a naked, virtually naked human body being taken down from the cross or being carried to a tomb. I mean, it just, and all the characters around it. There's so much drama. Compare that to a portrait that they might have to do of a noble's wife, or a very traditional religious scene. It was terribly exciting for them, and they went to town. And some of quite extraordinary artworks. So that's Easter in Art. Thoroughly recommend it. And then the final film of our season, but again, it might be slightly different in Australia, is Sunflowers. And this is based on an exhibition at the Van Gogh Museum, who we've worked with a few times. But it's a fascinating story about, well, the sunflowers, certainly one of the most famous paintings in art history. But actually, as many of you will know, there's more than one sunflower. He painted a series of them. Perhaps the most famous sunflowers are the sunflowers in a vase. And he painted 7 of those. One of them was destroyed in the war. Another one has disappeared into a very, very private collection. Nobody knows where it is. But the other 5 are in London, Amsterdam, Philadelphia, Munich, and Tokyo. And what this film does is it looks at why he painted the sunflowers, which also includes then a history of the sunflower, you know, the impact in this trade of flowers and bulbs and seeds, and the sunflower coming across from America, and the impact it had on artists. Van Gogh was not the first to film it, to paint the sunflower. Why did he paint the sunflower? Then the whole story with Gauguin. Why did he do so many variations? What do the variations show? The Van Gogh Museum analyzed their painting, and again, quite a lot was revealed about his process. To what extent did the sunflower represent his personality and his character? Why do they have such an impact on people? So that's a really interesting film, which is being edited at the moment. We went to all those 5 locations, so you'll see all 5 paintings at a certain point in comparison with one another. So it's just another way of looking at Van Gogh, who one poll has suggested is the world's favorite artist. He's certainly one of them, and rightly so. So that's our season. Although I think also, do you not have Leonardo the Works?
Yes, that's correct. Leonardo the Works and Lucian Freud as well.
Oh, Lucian Freud. Okay, so Leonardo the Works is a film that I made last year. Just the intention with Leonardo was to decide what was painted by Leonardo and what wasn't, because there's so much debate. You can ask people you'd ask historians and curators, how many Leonardos are there? And they'll say, oh, yeah, 17, 18, 20, 23. So I decided I'm going to find out for myself. And in the end, we have every Leonardo that he's involved in the film. And they are just extraordinary. And bear in mind that for him, painting was not the most important part of his, he was we know about Leonardo, he was a musician. His drawings are extraordinary. He was a sculptor. He put on court festivities. He did everything. He designed military weapons and defenses, and a most extraordinary man. But we focus on the paintings. 3 essential stages: when he's in somebody else's workshop as a young man, a guy called Verrocchio, and he's learning to be an artist. When he is his own man, and then when he has his own workshop and he has other very talented artists working with him, he might do the face, they might do some of the background. And they are just, and we go to the locations where these paintings are, so the Uffizi, the Hermitage, National Gallery of Art, all over the place. And we talk to experts in each location about this painting. Salvator Mundi, the most expensive painting ever sold at auction, $450 million. It's definitely a Leonardo. It's in the film. A very powerful, very spiritual film. Done very well for us, and rightly so, in the sense that he is quite extraordinary. And then Lucian Freud. So finally, it's always been my intention that exhibition on screen is as broad as it can be. And, we don't just want to make films about white, Western, European men. And so we're constantly trying to find ways of looking at art from elsewhere in the world, from over 5, 6 centuries, male, female. And that, of course, includes contemporary artists. One could talk quite a lot about this, but of course, the question I would ask is, well, who are the contemporary artists that sit alongside a Leonardo or a Raphael? In 100 years' time, when somebody writes, the top 100 artists of all time, who from today or the recent past will be in that list? Now, I suspect that David Hockney will, and Lucian Freud probably will. He is certainly one of the great British artists of the last 100 years. This was the first self-portrait exhibition ever of his work. He told his assistant, David Dawson, who wanted to do this exhibition, that you can't do it while I'm alive. Well, he died 3-4 years ago, so this is the exhibition. And it's a very powerful story, it's a very interesting biography, a complex character, but a really top painter, and hugely influential as a painter. So that's a very nice film, which I thoroughly recommend.
Great. We're looking forward to presenting them in our cinemas. So we've had one question so far in our chat, and if anyone else has questions, please pop them in there now. So this question comes from Sophie. How is an exhibition story conceived? Are you directed by the gallery with regard to how you should present the exhibition art or artist? Does the gallery ever veto the score or parts of your script?
So galleries never have any editorial say over the films at all. We allow the galleries, when a gallery is involved, if we're filming their exhibition, we work with them because we can learn from them and benefit from them. And we also let them see the film in case we've made an error. The worst thing that can happen for us is a caption error, or we get somebody's name wrong. And just on that, that's actually very difficult, because often artists didn't name their paintings, and so paintings have evolved, and names of paintings, and some names some paintings will have more than one name. They're not dated, so people will have different ideas of dates. And actually, you'll often see that the caption on the wall of the exhibition will have a different date than the caption in the catalogue. And certainly, if you go online, you're entering a world of pain. If you rely on Wikipedia, you're in trouble, because paintings can be misnamed, misdated, misappropriated. So so we ask the gallery, look at the film, and if they see something that they think is an error, then we'll talk to them about it. But they have no veto on the score. And in fact, if they asked for it, then we wouldn't make the film. That said, of course, realistically, we're not really doing anything that they're going to object to, because what we're actually doing is we're expanding we're democratizing their exhibitions. We're recording them. And these exhibitions have taken them 5, 6. I remember the Rembrandt took 20 years from conception to execution. We've recorded it, and they really like that. And then we're having it seen in Colombia and in Australia and in Ukraine and in South Africa, and so they like that too. The one area that they are a little bit cautious about, but we know this well enough now that it doesn't usually present any problems, but we will often film the installation of artworks. And if we happen to film somebody screwing in the paint, putting a painting on the wall, and we happen to show the exact screw that they've used, they'll ask us not to include that. Every screw that gets used is different to make it harder to steal. So anything that might compromise the security of the painting, they will say you can't include that. We know that well enough now that we don't film it. In terms of the storytelling, it's a good question. When we are basing the film on a major exhibition, like the Raphael right now, then yes, absolutely. We ask ourselves, well, we're not just going to take advantage of the exhibition to have access to the paintings. What is their story? What is the point of their exhibition? What are they trying to say? And whether it's the Lucian Freud at the Royal Academy recently, Raphael now, the Van Gogh with the sunflowers, what is their story? And to what extent is their story going to be our story? So are they telling a chronological, is it an overview of somebody's entire life? Which to some extent, well, to some extent the Raphael is, but the Raphael is also saying, you have to understand the importance of Rome on Raphael's work. And so that is also part of our story. Sometimes we will go a slightly different way. But yes, in terms of, and we'll go and see the curator very early on. We'll ask for a draft of the catalogue and we'll read the catalogue entries. Again, it all comes down to storytelling, and we would be foolish not to work from the story that the curator is trying to tell. Again, these curators have spent years putting forward a specific story. We're not bound to it, but we often do echo the story of the exhibition.
The next question comes from Robert Love, Riverside Theatre's director. Robert asks, have you had any thoughts of making a film about Australian art in general and Indigenous art and artists?
I've done 4 or 5 trips to Australia. Well, actually, no, some of those were exhibition on, were in the In Search Ofs. But anyway, whenever I come to Australia to talk about exhibition on screen, it's a legitimate question that I get asked. The answer is yes. I would love, I mean, I love any excuse to come to Australia, certainly pre-COVID days. I think it's a bit more complicated now. I went to the National Gallery, for example, in London when they had the Australian Impressionists show. I love the way that Impressionism has been used by other cultures to tell a local story. But we'd already done a history of European Impressionism with the Impressionists and the man who made them. We then did the Artist Garden American Impressionism, where the Americans came to Europe, learned Impressionist techniques, took it back to America and told a story of the United States through Impressionist painting. So to do it again with the Australian Impressionists felt like we were repeating a story when there's so much choice available to us. So we didn't do that. There was an Australian exhibition at the Royal Academy in London. It was called Australia. We did have a conversation, and I'll be honest, they warned us off. They said, you know, it is so complicated. Now, it's not, we shouldn't be afraid of that, but they said gaining the permissions for Indigenous Australian art is very difficult. Just putting on an exhibition is very complicated. To get permissions to make a film is complicated. Now, people have managed. It just so happened at that time we were so stretched in terms of staff and money that we just couldn't engage. You know, we just didn't have the resources that were needed to cope with that. Last time I was in Australia, in Perth, I saw a wonderful show of Indigenous art, and I thought this would have made a fantastic exhibition on screen. It was called something like Earth, Sky and Sea or something. It was very, very beautiful. The short answer is we're always thinking about non-European art. Or, of course, it could be a film which is a film about a Raphael, but it's an exhibition that's coming out of, Gallery of New South Wales, for example. That is possible. So it's always on the cards. It's always bubbling away. And I'm not afraid of the distance. I'm not afraid of flying to Australia and you know, if the project is relevant and I think it, you know, has interest globally, then we certainly entertain it.
But there are some thank yous, and good to hear your thoughts and experiences from Sophie.
We trying to create a community, and we encourage, well, on the exhibitiononscreen.com website, there are clips from previous films, behind the scenes videos, interviews with me or the editor or composer or a curator. Occasionally we might put an entire interview with somebody on. So there's plenty there for people that are interested. And on the, you know, we can all legitimately criticize Facebook for sure, but it does have a useful role as well, in that we have an Exhibition on Screen Facebook site where we're constantly posting stories about the art world, about our films. And it's also somewhere, and on Instagram as well, but it's somewhere that people can direct questions to us. So for example, if you watch the Leonardo or the Freud, and you just want to ask us a question, go ahead. I or one of my colleagues will answer. We encourage you to communicate with us. And of course, we encourage you to encourage others to watch our films, particularly now, for cinemas like yours, for filmmakers like us. If we can't get the audiences back and we can't expand the audiences, we're going to struggle. So, you know, we need your help a little bit too. But all being well, maybe this time next year, I can be there in person with, sunflowers or whatever it is going to be next year.
That would be fantastic. All right, well, this brings the event to an end. Special thanks to Phil for joining us for this Meet the Creator Q&A, and to everyone in the audience for being part of this unique event.
Thank you very much. Talk to you again.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.